So let me grab my book here. You know, when the time for me to think about a talk rolls around, um, I go to several sources pretty consistently for the topic. I mean, one is just life. It's like, okay, something out there is just so prominent right now that it needs to be talked about, and that's and for the moment, I'm going to at least today, I'm going to try to stay away from that because it can get pretty redundant, right? And but we can go there if you have questions or thoughts or want suggestions. Anyway, but so then I also get a daily thing from Tricycle. Maybe some of Margaret's nodding. Maybe get that too. You get a little like excerpt, right? So I'm going to come back to that. So I look at that, and then I like look at the koans. I kind of look and say, okay, what's because I like my talks to be sort of present and relevant to what's going on in our lives in our world right now. Um, so I look at a few different sources like that. But and this today nothing jumped out from me from the tricycle things. If those don't get it, there's like a little excerpt, typically from a book or a talk or something else given by a teacher, very often a Tibetan teacher, because I think tricycle has a sort of Tibetan bent to it. Um, but um, but it's a snippet, like a paragraph or a couple of paragraphs, and then you can access the article. But today, nothing jumped out at me. Sometimes they really jump out at me. I say, "Oh yeah, that's something I really want to talk." Nothing jumped out at me. But what did jump out at me is the fact that I get one of those. Some of you do too. One of those little things from Tricycle, 365 days a year, and there are 365 different, typically often new books that are referenced by teachers of various persuasions, Tibetans and Zen Buddhists, and so on and so forth. And it made me realize the astonishing volume of new books about Buddhism that are created every year. And so that's goes to this particular koan. So I'll come to the relevance of that. And this is in Blue, not in Blue Kurfurket, I'm sorry. This is in the Mumonkan case 39, Uman and a mistake in speech. A monk was asked Uman, the radiance serenely illuminates the whole vast universe. Before he could finish the first line, Uman suddenly interrupted. Aren't those the words of Chosetsu Sushai? The monk replied, yes, they are. Uman said, you have slipped up in the words. Afterwards, Zen Master Shishin brought up the matter and said, tell me, at what point did he slip? Well, this is a fundamental point, and it goes right back into the heart of the teachings of the Buddha. The point at which he slipped is when he opened his mouth and started quoting the words of Shosetsu Shusai. And if you remember back to the koan about Gutei's finger, that the young man in that encounter ends up having a finger removed for repeating the words of Gutai. Hopefully that isn't a true story, but it 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 um it shows what an essential point of the Dharma that is. And I think it's one that we often miss in this culture. I and probably most all of you have a whole library of books on Zen and Buddhism. And and as I pointed to earlier, that universe of Buddhist books is increasing exponentially. Every day, new books are being published. Many of them, as I was looking at them this morning, they're sort of often combining Buddhism and pop psychology, I think. And it's like about self-acceptance, or, Buddha never talked about self-acceptance. Bodhidharma never talked about self. You just sit in that cave for 8 years working on self-acceptance. 7 years, I guess. I don't want to exaggerate. Anyway, but right. So, but we, as we're kind of, and that's it isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think it's often a good thing, because I think often Buddhism and Zen just assumed we were going to go off in a cave and practice ad infinitum, and those of us who are living in the world, who have families, who have jobs, who are dealing with all these kinds of situations, do have psychological reactions. And we have to somehow integrate those psychological reactions with our practice. And I'm not saying that the monks in the monasteries didn't have psychological reactions, but I think we have far more triggers that we have to deal with in different ways. We can't just ignore them and go back and do zazen, if a strong feeling comes up. And I don't know about all of you, but I have a lot of strong feelings coming up these days. And we have to deal with them. They're part of our reality. Our emotional being is part of our reality. Again, I think if we look at sort of classic Buddhist literature and the early writings of the Buddha and others, emotions very seldom come up, and it's mostly about forget about them, you know. But I think it's fair to say that in this day and age, our emotions and those aspects of our lives are a relevant part of our practice. And I as a teacher would be, I don't know what the right word would be, if I just said, well, forget about those and, go back to your breath, or, I, I don't think that would be a very good answer. I don't think that would help any of us live our lives. And so we've got this whole added dimension of complexity. As we're trying to live in the world, as we're trying to live as multi-dimensional human beings, and that doesn't mean we're going into the fifth dimension or something. It means we're, all of the complexities of having an emotional life, an intellectual life, and so on and so forth. And yet, at the same time, what Uman is pointing to here is critical. There are no words that can teach us the Dharma. There is no number of Buddhist books that we can read that will bring us the truth of the Dharma. the expression is that Zen teachers are liars. Why are we liars? Because we never can express the truth of the Dharma. We're always approximating it, or we're using metaphors, we're using some kind of way to communicate it, but we can never really communicate it. And so the same thing is true of all of these books and essays and things that are being written. They equally miss the point, which is not the fault of the authors. That's the reality of the Dharma. The true Dharma cannot be expressed in words, and it can never be given to you. You can read every book ever written on Buddhism, and I think which is impossible. I think Steph once told me that there's more books written on Buddhism than any other religion. For people who don't have words, and we have a lot of words. But we can't get the Dharma from those books. Even if we read every one of them. In fact, I think it's the opposite. I think if we read every one of them, we'd be so confused and have so many different ideas running around in our heads and quoting so many different teachers. And, we'd be even further from the mark. Sort of going back to Suzuki Roshi's wonderful little book. Now I'm going to say now that I've been down on books, I'm going to go back to that wonderful little book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. And probably many, if not most of you, have read that at some time or another, thinking that that was going to be a book for beginners. And because he's got that word in the title. And it absolutely isn't. It's an extremely profound book and quite befuddling. At least I read it. It was one of the first books, or maybe even the first book on Zen that I read, and left me scratching my head. That's why I don't have any hair anymore. But it was like, there was this luminosity to his words. There was something that drew me in, that I felt like, oh my God, this is something I want to know more about. And what the F is he talking about? It was both those things, which in a sense is wonderful, but unfortunately not a book for beginners. And so I think there may be people who come along and read that book and then think, well, this is not for me. And which is unfortunate. And it is a wonderful, wonderful book, and he was a wonderful teacher. But Suzuki Roshi, as brilliant a teacher as he was, can't give us the Dharma. His book can't give us the Dharma. Nobody's book can give us the Dharma. And I think that's a kind of fault of our Western minds. We are so intellectually oriented. We are so educated that our inclination when we want to learn about something is read a book. And if we still don't get it, read some more books. Get a whole library. We'll figure it out. And yet, while occasionally those books may give us a little glimmer of insight or may point us in a direction or may, I mean, a book was what brought me to the Dharma. And it wasn't a Buddhist book. I was reading Thomas Merton's Asian Journals. And for those of you who know or don't know about Merton was a Trappist monk, but towards the end of his life, and he had a terrible premature death in a plane crash in South Asia. No, Margaret says no, he didn't die in a plane crash.
I think it was a fan, an electrical fan. He was in the bathtub. He was electrocuted.
Executed to death. Yeah.
He was electrocuted. Why didn't I know that? Maybe he was on the plane when he was taking the bath. Well, there you go. Don't listen. That's another point of the Dharma. Don't listen to anything that I say. Well, there. Anyway, does I guess the cause of his death is not so relevant as is the fact that he died very prematurely, and he was a very wonderful man. Um, but anyway, towards the end of his life, uh, traveling in Southeast Asia, he became very interested in Buddhism. And so in this Asian journal, he describes an encounter that he had, I think, while in India with Trungpa Rinpoche, Tibetan teacher who is notorious for other reasons. But he found that what he his comment he made in his journal was that Trungpa was a genuine spiritual teacher, and and I, as someone who knew next to nothing about anything, thought, oh, and I didn't have a way of discerning. I'm taking Merton. I trusted Merton. If he says this guy's a good teacher, then he probably is a good teacher. And he mentioned that Trungpa had a practice center called at that time Tail of the Tiger. In It was located in Vermont. Um, and this is before the days of the internet, obviously, so you couldn't just like yeah. So I actually had to drive to this place, the Tail of the Tiger. Only by then it was now called Karma Choling. The name had changed, and I drove out there because I wanted to find out how can I learn about this Buddhism thing, this Dharma thing. And they said, "Well, did you know that we have a practice center right?" I was that time living over near Burlington. They said, "Do you know we have a practice center in Burlington right near you where you can go and sit?" And I didn't. So the next week I trotted myself down there and I got my first basic meditation instruction. Um, and not long after that, heard a talk by Daido Roshi and got kind of drawn over to Zen. But that said, the book was the catalyst for me. The book was the catalyst. Merton's words were the catalyst that got me to seek out Karma Choling, and Karma Choling pointed me to a place. And then they very nice person took me in a room, gave me basic sitting instructions, and then I went and sat with the group, and so on and so forth. So anyways, so books can be valuable. Books can give us certain things. In this case, information, but not the Dharma. Right. So what this koan is pointing to, and where I'm going with this whole thing, there is only one source of the Dharma. And that source is right between your ears. It's you. It's right there. It's only by going in, only by doing zazen, only by practicing that the Dharma can be revealed to us. It cannot come from a book or 1,000 books. Now, back to sort of my early point. Now, on the other hand, I think that there are some of these new aspects of the Dharma, like dealing with psychological issues. One of the one I was reading about was self-acceptance. Okay, Buddha never talked about self-acceptance. You know, uh, Dogen never talked about self-acceptance. I could name everybody down through the centuries. Self-acceptance is important. So psychologically, we know that it's important. And I hadn't thought about this, but I do think it's probably important to our practice of the Dharma. It's not the Dharma. but practice. We have to trust ourselves to trust the Dharma. You know, the expression is that we have to have great faith, great doubt. Great faith, great doubt. What's the third? Faith, doubt. Anyway, determination. Great faith, great doubt, great determination. Right? Those are the three elements that we need for practice. Okay, well, that faith, to a certain extent, is faith that the teachings of the Buddhas apply to us, that we can, in fact, transform ourselves through the practice of the Dharma. That we are not, we are not so worthless, so hopeless, so whatever kinds of ways in which we disrespect ourselves, that we cannot attain the way through practice. That's it. So those things, I think that the self-acceptance can be important to helping us sustain, not only in in our lives. Well, it's important in our lives. If we're too negatively oriented towards ourselves, that can be an obstacle just in our lives, but it can also be an obstacle to our practice. It helps us to have the faith and the determination, right? That, the Buddha was very clear about that, as has been everybody down the line. Everyone has the capacity to experience the Dharma, to live the Dharma. That's not a unique thing to a certain group of people. But we often don't have the confidence in that. And the nature of practice is such that it can erode that confidence. Because it's possible to go months, years, whatever, without noticing any big, it's like, oh, I'm sitting every day, and I'm not noticing anything happening. It's possible to go years like that. And in fact, at the end of the road, nothing is happening. You just wasted all that time. Years of your life waiting for the big bang. And then it's just a little ripple in the pond. But it requires that faith, that doubt, that determination to keep going through the process, to keep going through the times when there are no stale times. There are no times when if we are practicing, that we are not being transformed by the Dharma, but we just don't see it. And those can be times we get discouraged. We want to quit. It's like, oh, well, whatever, I'm not getting anything out of this. I think I'm going to go check out one of those self-help gurus online or something like that, right? But the Dharma comes from within us, and the only way to reveal it ultimately is through that consistent, persistent practice. I had that conversation with somebody this morning about the consistency, which was something that Margaret emphasized to me and something that I'm a tremendous believer in. Consistent practice, daily practice. Doesn't need to be hours every day. I mean, if you happen to have the time and the inclination, that's fine. But if you can, Margaret would say, if you can only sit for 5 minutes, sit for 5 minutes. But sit. Don't skip the day. You know, you have a busy day, you get home from work, you're late, you're exhausted, you can still sit for a little bit, you know, just a little bit. But it's infinitely better than nothing. So that's where the Dharma is revealed. It's not revealed in books, right? It's not revealed in books. It's revealed slowly, slowly, slowly through the course of our life and through our practice. And going back to Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, Suzuki Roshi has a lovely image in that book that talks about being out in the rain and getting wet. And what he says is that, you know, if you go out in the rain, you're wet, you know, your clothing is soaked and so on and so forth. If you go out in the fog, you don't notice that you're getting wet until you come back in, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, my clothes are soaked. And that was his, I think, very appropriate analogy for how the Dharma works in our lives. We don't constantly see progress. It's not like every time we sit down, or every 1,000 times we sit down, we're going to have some great revelation or breakthrough or whatever the heck it is we think we're looking for. But gradually, that soaks in because of that consistent practice. No substitute for that. There's absolutely no substitute for that. We cannot read the most brilliant, I don't know, you know, there's all these, there are wonderful, I mean, I don't want to detract at all from it, you know, wonderful teachers, wonderful people, Pema Chodron being one who has a lot of wonderful books, and others. But doesn't substitute for just quietly sitting and following our practice. Thank you.
Oh, Peter, I can see my teacher nodding to you. Her first instructions to me were put away the book, put away all the books and sit. And I knew she was wrong because I had never, ever been able to master anything without studying. And it didn't take long for me to find out she was right. And she would say what your Margaret said, get your tush on the cush every single day, no matter what. And yes, the fog does work.
Yeah, it does. Slow. We could go for years without discernible change, and yet we're constantly changing. We're just not seeing it. So in those times, it's so important in those times. I mean, that's one of the real, you know, we come back to the three treasures, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. So the two of those treasures in particular, you know, but more than any of the others, probably the Sangha treasure. That's why we need it. That's why we need to come together weekly as a group like this, because our commitment to Sangha can help us get through some of those stale periods, some of those periods when we're doubting, some of those periods when we're feeling isolated or, you know, alienated. It's like, okay, but we've got the Sangha. And if doing this is crazy, well, there's a bunch of other crazy people doing it also. You know, I get to see it. That's, you know, one of the wonderful things about being a teacher. I get to see how you're all changing when you don't. I won't tell you that one on one, but your heads won't fit in the little Zoom box anymore. And that, um, but I see it. I see it almost week to week. I see how people are changing, and those that are doing koans and their expressions of the koans and so on.
Well, two comments. I started out in Shambhala as well, and one of the teachers at the very beginning said, "I'll guarantee you, particularly you new people, but most of you are here for the wrong reason." It kind of piqued me a little bit. I said, but turns out I think he was right, after all. And one thing that you said seems to come to mind today, which is Zen. I think you said it this way, isn't really Buddhism, it's more Taoism. And that was very kind of released me a bit. Tao seems to be so poetic and ineffable. And so it just moved the literature aside. Uh, anyway, just a thought.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, that sort of goes, you know, as when Buddhism came to China, it wasn't Zen. It was more like what we now associate with the Theravadan Buddhism of Southeast Asia. Um, but yes, what happened was it got influenced by the Taoists. And so, and I'm kind of drawn to that because there's that element of sort of, you know, freedom and almost creativity in Taoism, um, because it's so lacking in structure, right? Taoism doesn't have a, Buddhism has a structure, but Taoism really doesn't have a structure. So that's kind of opened the door to have all the kind of wild men and women of Zen who I think were influenced by their Taoist neighbors anyway. But then and that's sort of where I'm drawn. That's just by virtue of my personality and orientation, And then, of course, when it went to Japan, the Japanese are codifiers and systematizers and so on and so forth. So Zen in Japan got very codified, very systematized, um, and it has a very different spirit than that earlier Chinese Taoist influenced spirit. All the same Dharma, but kind of different emphases.
So it was always actually a great relief to me, Peter, when I would go talk with you about sort of lamenting the fact that I didn't read all these books that everybody else read about Zen, and I just wasn't really drawn to doing that. Not that I didn't read some, but it was always a relief to me, when you would say to me, you don't have to do that. Um, so my husband, Vic, he used to quote this line from a Donovan song, and he would do it to me. It was very annoying sometimes, actually, because I would be trying to convince him of something because of something I read. And he would say from this Donovan song, the book you are reading is just one man's opinion of moonlight. And that really, you know, he's been gone for 8 years, but that comes up for me. It's like part of me. And I remember that when I'm reading something. Um, okay. This is just one man's opinion of moonlight. And that that really sets with me. Um, so I just wanted to share that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anything, right? We can't put moonlight in a book. We can't put bird songs in a book. Just yesterday, I heard a Phoebe for the first time this spring. And for me, at least, that's like just a wonderful experience. I love the Phoebes, and like, oh my God, they're back. Can't put that in a book and capture it. You can write about it, or you can say it like I just did, but it doesn't hold a candle to that song of the Phoebe out in the woods for the first time on a sunny spring day. Art in all its forms is imitating life, but it is not life. And it can be beautiful, right? It's like poetry. There are poets that I love because they're evocative. They're evoking images of life that resonate, but they're still not life. They're just reminding me, which reminds me of a koan. Let's see if I can find it. I found it earlier this morning. Here it is. A monk asked Fuketsu in all earnestness. Both speech and silence are concerned with re and me. How can we transcend them? Fuketsu said, I constantly think of Conan in March, where partridges are chirping among hundreds of fragrant blossoms. I constantly think of Conan in March, where partridges are chirping among hundreds of fragrant blossoms. I constantly think of unity in March, where phoebes are chirping in the barren brush. Gotta wait a while for blossoms. But
Peter,
I think that, oh, go ahead.
no,
Go
no,
ahead.
no.
No, but I think that what he's doing, what Fuketsu is doing, is calling us back to the reality, right? Calling us back to the things that affect us, that move us to life, to life. Okay, go ahead, RJ.
Oh, no, I was going to say, I think I might be in the minority here, so I apologize. But I use perhaps books or my reading a little bit differently in that I try to perhaps see the different perspectives that all point towards the same thing. And sometimes I find that whether it's a concept or a thought or a feel or whatever, makes a little bit more sense when I hear or read somebody's different viewpoint on it. So it kind of, I think, can sometimes enhance a little bit. Not necessarily point, but perhaps help me understand it or see it or, I don't know, experience it a little bit differently. Perhaps not better, but differently. Also, for me, and I heard this phrase or something like it said somewhere, is sometimes you need to hear something 1,000 times before it sort of really kind of seeps in. And I find reading sometimes does that. I might have heard the same concept over and over and over different ways, but somebody presents it just a little bit differently. And then it's like, got it. It can be an intellectual exercise, but also I think help you absorb it. I don't know, certain concepts or something you might not have really gotten before. So not as a instead of, but I think sometimes as a as well as.
Okay, well, I have a lot to say about that. Um, and um, I'm going to start by saying, don't believe it because I said it. Okay, and so I constantly say lots of things that are not. I'm just making stuff up anyway. But even when I think I'm being truthful, I can miss the mark and so on and so forth. And again, back to the filter. What's the filter? Your experience, your life. So what I experience, what I say, hold it lightly and determine its relevance for yourself. And if something I'm saying doesn't quite work for you, that's fine. That's, it's your experience of your life and the Dharma. That is, that's what the Buddha said. Don't believe, he said it. Don't believe it because I say it. Only believe your own experience. That's the criteria in Zen. It's a dangerous one these days because people are using that to kind of justify anti-science perspectives and stuff like that. Um, just because the doctors at Johns Hopkins University say it doesn't mean it's true. Well, actually, it kind of does. But that's it. Anyway, but yeah, so that having that, having that, this is not about either my opinion or a majority opinion. It's about your truth. Always, always, always keep that focused in the center of your mind. But now here's the but. In that discussion, you used the C word several times. Everybody's like, what? What? We didn't hear that. The C word that she used was concept, right? So it helped you with concepts. Um, and so that might be something to look at. It's like, okay, because Zen is not conceptual, right? Not knowing is nearest. Somebody brought that up this morning. Dizang's saying not knowing is nearest. Not knowing has no concepts. Zen has no concepts. You don't have to. It may be helpful, and I'm not saying this to be critical at all, but we also don't have to get any concepts. We don't have to get any concepts. You all know the story about the Buddha and the young man who was mentally challenged that was in his sangha. Have I told that recently? No, good. Okay. So there was in the Buddha Sangha a young man who I don't know I don't have the exact correct language that we now use, developmentally disabled or mentally challenged in some way. And he came to the Buddha and he was very frustrated. And he said, everybody here is getting, realization, getting enlightenment, and I'm not, um, the Buddha said, well, would you like that? And he said, yes. He said, that's okay. He said, I guess there was a ball there. He said, bring the ball over. And the Buddha said, I'm going to throw this ball to you 3 times, and you're going to catch it 3 times. And when you catch it the third time, you're going to be enlightened. You can guess the end of the story. So what happened there? Do you think? I'm going to throw this out as a question. What happened? Why was that young man able to realize himself in that moment just from catching the ball 3 times?
Does it have anything to do with kind of being given permission, being told that you will receive it at the third throw of the ball?
Well, it has everything
Like
to do with that. But what did that do for that young man?
like kind of give confidence?
Yeah, faith. He's been used the word faith. It's like the we talked. I said earlier about great faith, great doubt, great determination. You know, so he was lacking the faith in that case in his own ability to realize the Dharma. But the Buddha said it. He believed it. It worked. Okay, and there's a lesson in that for all of us that the Dharma works. We don't get it by catching a ball 3 times, but that faith is important. It's what that story really fooled. If we're thinking, I'll never get this, I don't really have it, da 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 da, all those people are brilliant somehow, but that's a huge detriment to our practice. So there's this kind of odd thing. We don't want to be like self-confident, but we also want to believe that if we practice, the results of practice will happen for us. And they do, guarantee that. I used to be a guy I used to listen to, when I lived in Vermont, television from Montreal. And there was a guy who had an ad on all the time, was from Dorian Suits. And he would say, you're going to love my suits. I guarantee it. So I guarantee it. You'll get it. Guarantee it. What Margaret said earlier, sit every day, just practice. And it will, just as surely as walking in the fog, you will get wet. And having some faith and confidence in that. So, okay.
Creations are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to put an end to them. Reality is boundless. I vow to perceive it. The enlightened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. Creations are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to put an end to them. Reality is boundless. I vow to perceive it. The enlightened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. Creations are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to put an end to them. Reality is boundless. I vow to perceive it. The enlightened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Have a lovely day.